Hello, everybody. All right, my name's Dave Munger, and I'm a librarian with Sacramento Public Library. Welcome to this month's genealogy workshop, What Did Daddy Do and What Did Mommy Do? Locating Family Members in Old Business Records, Part 2, with our speaker, Madeline Yanov. Today's session will be recorded and available on our YouTube channel indefinitely. I'll put the link to our YouTube channel in the chat. Again, for questions about future genealogy presentations or to receive a copy of the handout, please email contact@saclibrary.org. I'll also post a copy of the handout to the chat for download. Now I'd like to introduce today's speaker, Madeline Yanov. Madeline Yanov, the owner of Time Travel Genealogy, has more than 30 years of genealogy experience, specializing in American research. Since most Americans are descendants of immigrants, she is very familiar with European genealogy, specifically Irish, British, the Slovak region, and Russian, with a little German on the side. She has also been instrumental in locating and helping reunite adoptees with their birth parents. In her other life, before becoming a full-time genealogist, Madeline was a paralegal whose expertise included the discovery for cases. This experience helped her in genealogy to analyze what to search for and how to find it. She has a degree in history and political science and uses those disciplines to tell the stories of her clients' ancestors. Madeline believes that genealogy is more than just names and dates. It's the stories behind our ancestors' lives that make them real to us. She was a weekly volunteer at the Oakland, California Regional Family History Center until May 2023. Since 2011, she has been an indexer with FamilySearch.org. In 2012, Madeline was elected to the board of directors of the Contra Costa County Genealogical Society and is currently the president emeritus of that society. She also represents the Contra Costa County Genealogical Society in the Sacramento Regional Genealogical Council and the East Bay North Bay Genealogy Networking Group. In addition to being a member of various local genealogical societies, she is a member of APG, the Association of Professional Genealogists. She loves traveling, meeting people, hearing their family stories, and sharing her love of history and genealogy with anyone interested. Her presentation today is What Did Daddy Do and What Did Mommy Do? Locating Family Members in Old Business Records, Part 2. Thank you for joining us, Madeline. I'll pass the virtual mic to you now.
Well, thanks, David, for that lovely introduction. How are all of you? If those of you that don't know me, my name is Madeline Yanov, and I am back to present our topic of locating old family records and business records, part 2. If I sound a little flustered, I can't reach my slideshow. Oh, there it is. My slideshow button to turn this on. So last month, what we did was we ended up talking about business records in general. Oh, now I'm getting nothing. This is going to be an interesting talk.
There, I see it.
There we are. There we are. Anyway, we found genealogy records for entities like corporations. We found your ancestor in professional fields, small business records. And today we're going to focus on specific industries. Industries like mining, the railroads, assembly plants, and some smaller businesses like farming, photography studios, and mortuaries. What we will discuss today is how you can identify your ancestor's occupation, what records exist, and where they are. So there's so much information out there. I'm just honestly scratching the surface. As some of you may know, if you've heard my talks before, I pack a lot of information in my talks. And you can probably figure that out by the handout. But they end up turning into a crash course on the subject. So by the time we finish, you're going to be experts. There will be no problem. In fact, I hope by the end of the session that you will have no problem in identifying records for your ancestors. And you're going to end up finding out how many sources and repositories there are to help you get that information. So what we're going to do today, if my computer is not acting up, is find out why these certain industry records are different. We're going to just generally recap sources for occupations from the last talk about railroad workers, miners, assembly plant workers, that's automotive and non-automotive, truckers, and then we'll go to garment workers. After that, we'll very briefly talk about unions, photographers, morticians or funeral homes, civilian government jobs. And we'll touch a little bit about the WPA and the CCC. And then we're going to end up with farmers. So like I said earlier, this list is no means exhaustive, but you are going to find a lot of occupations that we generally encounter in genealogy. So let's get started. The general sources for occupations include censuses from 1850 onward, which are going to be listing an occupation for the individual. City directories are also going to be useful because they're going to list people with their occupations and employers. And there's also a business section separately in that directory. Military records like draft records or enlistment or separation papers are going to indicate what that person's occupation was and the last employer. Passenger lists and naturalization records also include an occupation. County histories are going to tell about the early settlers of the county and also about prominent men in the county. Your vital records, like birth, marriage, and death, are going to many times include occupations and details for the individual and the occupation of their parents, at least on the birth records. Tax and voting records are also going to frequently list occupations as well. But why are these industries more important than others? Well, first of all, they stand out because they had a national impact. Your mines and your railroads are not going to be confined to a certain region or affect only that region. And many times, certain industries are going to be crucial to the national economy. You'll have to excuse me. I need a drink of water. There you go. Some of these industries had hazardous conditions, like mines and railroads. And so the concern about these employees led to labor movements. Abuses in these industries also led to reform movements. Public outcry would spark interest in reforming certain industries. A notable example is the Triangle Shirtwaist Factory Fire in 1911, which prompted workplace safety reforms and helped popularize the International Ladies Garment Workers Union. These industries also were made up of thousands and thousands of union workers. So what they did was they helped foster the union in these industries. They also contributed to urbanization by attracting very large groups of immigrants who settled in large cities. And finally, during wartime, they contributed to the national security, playing a key role. So these are some of the reasons why certain industries are going to get a little bit more attention than the local hardware store or the mom and pop grocery store. So let's start with railroad workers. Many families, including mine, had a member who worked for the railroad. By 1920, 1 out of every 50 people worked in the railroad industry. By the 1900s, even children were working in the railroad, often in cramped spaces where it was easier for a young boy to go into than it would be for a full-grown man. When we think of railroad workers, we usually think of men, but women were also employed in the industry as well. During World War II, many women worked in track maintenance because the men had gone to fight. And some, like my grandmother, worked for the railroads as telegraph operators. So your railroad employee can be as young as 15, or she could be a woman, or she could be non-white. So how do we find our ancestors' railroad records? Well, first of all, you need to find the railroad that they worked for. You can narrow it down by finding a railroad near your ancestor's home. And the best way to do this is maps, whether you know what railroad it was or not. Some of the best historical maps are going to be found at the Library of Congress. Also, David Rumsey's map collection is another great one for historical maps. And some states, specifically Ohio and Pennsylvania, they had railways crossing each other. They got together and they were in a special historic transportation map. It's called Rails and Trails Historic Transportation Maps. The URL is on the screen, but it's also in the handout. And this showed every single rail line that went through Ohio or Pennsylvania. Now, county and town histories also have details about railroads and which ones went through them. You're going to find those in state libraries and archives. City directories listed railroads that went near or through the city. So you're going to find out what railroads your ancestor might have applied to work for, because these are the ones that were in his hometown. Newspapers are going to tell you about nearby railroads. They'll be telling you about strikes and other events. And keep in mind, your ancestor might have worked for multiple railroads. They might have started in one railroad and then switched over to another. So it's important to research all the railroads, oops, I'm not done yet, in near their home, even the ones that merged. Okay, so now that we found the railroad, we need to find the railroad workers. But employee records are divided sort of between 1936 and after 1936. 1936 was a pivotal year for the railroads because the Railroad Retirement Board was created, and that was going to manage records, especially retirement records, for the railroad employees. But finding records before 1936 it might be a little bit challenging because they're scattered all over the place. Between 1840 and 1870, there was a very large turnover of employees. Over 50% of them left their company after 6 months, and only 25% lasted 2 years or longer. And also during that time, the workforce tripled every decade from 1840 to 1880. The railroad would triple, driven by expansion of the railroads and the need for more and more workers. So if you are looking for pre-1936 records, the first place to look for is the company archives of that record, or of that railroad. Now, not all of the railroads are going to have complete records. You will have to find that out beforehand. Also, state archives have records on railroads, some more than others. The Pennsylvania State Archives is known to be one of the best archives having railroad records. Libraries, both public and private, like the Newberry Library, and state libraries are going to have records on employees. Historical societies and railroad museums are going to have employee records. The Pennsylvania State Archives that I just mentioned and the California State Railway Museum are going to have records on workers. Now, this retirement board came about because private pension plans had covered most workers, but they were tied to the success of the business. So when the profits increased, the benefits increased or stayed the same. When the profits decreased, the benefits decreased. Now, one thing you're going to need to know is that private companies are not required by law to retain any records for any particular amount of time or share their records with you. So you just have to keep that in the back of your mind when you contact these archives for information on your ancestor. But things are a little easier to find after 1936 because, as I said, the Railroad Retirement Board was created to administer a retirement benefits program for every railroad employee that was working at 1936 or hired afterwards. It does not have any records for any employee that worked before 1936. So if you want to access this, you're going to have to locate the Social Security number for your ancestor. Now, the Social Security numbers that were mainly given to employees of the railroad were between 700 and 726. That would be the first 3 letters of your Social Security number. 1963, that was changed, and they just started receiving random numbers. You can find the Social Security number a couple of ways. One of the easiest ways is to look for the Social Security death index. And that is going to be on sites like Ancestry or MyHeritage. A lot of the genealogy databases will have that. Most genealogy databases are going to cover the death index from 1936 to 2014. And Ancestry and MyHeritage also provide access to the Social Security applications and claim index. And that also runs from 1936, but it'll run to 2007. So you file request for this information, Social Security, under a Freedom of Information Act, you give them the full name of the employee and their Social Security number. Now, you can only make these requests for deceased individuals. You can, in some cases, get the request, or you can make a request by submitting a written consent from a living individual. I would advise you that if you do that, you get it notarized. So you can prove to the Railroad Retirement Board that, yes, this person is who they say they are. I have the address for the Retirement Board on the screen. It's also in your handout. But the Retirement Board has had a very bad retention policy. Bad for genealogists, at least. In the late 1960s, they proposed cost-saving measures. And the proposal was to destroy all records 30 years after the last payment. Well, this sparked a huge outrage and a large outcry from historians and genealogists, which caused them to pause the policy. But what happened is that some records had been destroyed up to that point before they were able to microfilm them. Since 2001, there's been limited access to the records. As I mentioned before, when requesting records for a living individual, you have to retain a written permission. And when requesting records for someone that's deceased, you're going to have to offer proof of direct relationship to that person. You are going to find repositories and sources for railroad records in the following places. The Interstate Commerce Commission has accident reports, and that covers the railroads from 1911 to 1993. You can find information about railroads in journal and newspaper articles. Ancestry magazine, I don't think they're published anymore because I haven't seen them, but they had an article by George Morgan in the May-June 2005 issue, where he goes after every single way you can find information on a railroad employee. And the National Archives in 1997 published in their Prologue magazine a feature on researching railroads. You can also find a lot of information using finding aids that the Library of Congress puts out. And Percy, the periodical source index at the Allen County Library, also has a lot of information on railroads, as does Cindy's List. You're going to find information in genealogy databases like Ancestry or Family Search. I wouldn't just only look at the records that Family Search has. I would also look at their catalog to see where your ancestors, where there might be a record that might have your ancestor in it. And the Family Search Wiki, I highly recommend that. Union records are going to give you information. The Brotherhood of Sleeping Car Porters, commonly known as the Pullman Porters. Those are found at Emory University. And there are others like the Brotherhood of Locomotive Engineers and Trainmen. Their archives are at the Kiel Center for Labor. I'm saying that wrong. The Kiel Center at Cornell University. You're also going to find information on railroad museums. You've got the B&O's Railroad Museums, Hayes-Watkins Research Library, and our own California State Railroad Museum, and the National Archives. Their Atlanta region hosts the Railroad Retirement Board records and also accident reports. Newspapers are also going to be valuable for highlighting train incidents, accidents, maybe the milestone achieved by a long-time employee, or obituaries that often mention the employer of the deceased. Certain state archives are known for railroad records. These are Pennsylvania, California, Illinois, New York, Texas, Ohio, Indiana, and Missouri, and some of them hold employee records. Some genealogy societies are going to have employee records. The South Suburban Genealogical and Historical Society, that's located in suburban Chicago, they have all the records for Pullman employees. Now, these are employees of the Pullman Car Works. These are not the Pullman porters. Libraries hold a lot of railroad information. The Library of Congress has an extensive railroad collection. The Newberry Library in Chicago has the Chicago, Burlington, and Quincy Railroad employment records. And certain local libraries and historical societies will have records on regional rail lines. You might find information about your ancestor or their railroad in national historical societies, like the National Railway Historical Society. You're going to find information about your ancestor and their railroad in industry magazines, like the ones listed in Google Books or Internet Archive or HathiTrust. And many industry magazines are located on those sites. For example, the Brotherhood of Locomotive Engineers magazine is available on Google Books. Maps are going to be invaluable. The best historical maps are found at the Library of Congress, Dave Rumsey's map collection, and state archives, which hold historical maps of that region. Now we're going to transition to minors. My husband's father grew up in a Pennsylvania mining family. His grandfather was a miner in Slovakia, and when he came to the United States, he mined around Pittsburgh, as did all of my husband's uncles. The family jokes that my father-in-law was the only one who escaped the mines. Mining became a way of life in many families in the communities. People have been trying to mine in the United States since the very beginning. In 1607, people came to Jamestown looking for gold. By 1855, there were over 300,000 men in California to find gold. At the same time, the coal industry is booming. In 1880, you had 200,000 coal miners in the United States. But by 1923, that had skyrocketed to over 724,000 coal miners in the US. But that started decreasing, and by 2004, there were only 83,000 coal miners. Now, the early miners were predominantly English and Welsh, and they were followed by the Irish. But about 1900, Italian, Greek, and East European immigrants began arriving in large numbers, and many of them went to work in the mines. Well, you have all these different ethnic and cultural groups that are different from one another. That may lead to ethnic tensions. And mine operators exploited these tensions because certain groups, like the Slavs, would mine for lower wages than other groups. And this practice sort of weakened the already fragile labor unions. But despite this challenge, in 1890, John Mitchell unites the workers of diverse ethnic backgrounds into what is known as the United Mine Workers of America. And this enables them to have a strong collective voice. So, like the railroad, we need to find the mine. How do you find the mine? Well, census records may list someone as a miner, and every now and then you get a notation by the enumerator, what mine. City directories are going to list mines and their owners. State and area maps are going to be able to identify mines. So if you get an area map that shows the town, it may show the various different mines near that town. County recorders or county clerks have records of mines and their owners. Industry associations, like the Pennsylvania Coal Association, can be a valuable resource. Libraries, both local and state, are going to hold records pertinent to that area or that company. Historical societies, both local and state, also have additional resources that you can check. Online databases like ProQuest or JSTOR are helpful in finding newspapers or journals. For those that don't know, ProQuest has a lot of historical newspapers on it, and JSTOR has scholarly journals about various different topics. And networking can also help you find a mining company. You reach out to a local historian or connect to people on social media for resources can be very helpful. So how do we find the records? Well, miners moved around a lot. And so what their family and friends would do is that they would take out, for want of a better word, like info wanted notice in that section of union newspapers. They would put someone's name in it and seeking information on so-and-so, last seen working at such and such a mine. And sometimes you can get information on that. My thing is going crazy. But you probably are going to have a better chance of getting it through Social Security. Obtain an SS5, which is the application for a Social Security card, which might list a miner's employment history before they applied for the card. Company archives are also going to have personnel records. State and county archives in Pennsylvania, Michigan, and Ohio are especially useful if you have relatives from there. But almost all states had something mined in it. So you are going to find state archives dealing with the various different resources in that area. Local libraries and historical societies are going to be very good for finding the minor records because libraries in mining towns often housed relevant, I should say, archives. And sometimes they can provide information and documents that the larger archives won't have. If your ancestor was a member of the UMWA, you check their archive because they maintain records such as membership records, dues payment, work history, and so on. If your ancestor was involved in a mine that had accidents or was killed in a mine accident or injured, these accident reports are going to be held both at the state level and sometimes local archives and the U.S. Mine Safety and Health Administration. So what sources are we going to find them in? Well, first of all, you're going to start with the mining company. Next, if you have an ancestor who mined coal in Appalachia, Coal Camp USA, and this URL is also in your handout. My computer's going crazy. Has an encyclopedia of Appalachian coal towns. Government records are also going to be a valuable source. Social Security, but also the Mine Safety and Health Administration, the National Archives, and an agency called the National Institute for Occupational Safety and Health. Really long title. That's going to have accidents. Historical societies and associations are also going to be very, very helpful because they either have records from industry-specific societies or they can point you to those societies. Industry-specific societies are like the Coal and Coke Heritage Center, which focuses on Pennsylvania. Regional organizations also have records from coal mining areas. You have museums that will have information about various different mines or the coal mining industry, like the National Mining Hall of Fame, and then state museums, like the California State Mining and Mineral Museum. Periodicals about the industry are often found in university libraries. And union records, the United Mine Workers of America, their collection includes membership records and work histories and other union-related materials. So check out the UMWA for information on your ancestor. And because this is California, I can't leave mining without talking about the gold rush. I won't spend a lot of time going into these. This slide is in your handout. But I just want to tell you there are a lot of places that you may or may not have thought of. There's obviously the state archives and county archives, especially of the counties that had a lot of activity. The Bureau of Land Management, if someone staked a claim, you might want to try there. Library of Congress has a very large, extensive record collection of gold rush records. Newspapers. The San Francisco Public Library has a fantastic amount of records in their California history room. And museums, gold rush museums in Colma, Nevada County, and in Sacramento, along with online genealogy websites like Family Search and Ancestry should give you a lot of information on gold rush records and finding your ancestor that was a minor. Now we're going to put together some cars. You have to find the occupation. The occupation of an auto worker listed in censuses was not just auto worker. Sometimes there were references to specific companies like Ford or GM, and sometimes specific titles. City directories most likely are going to list the plant name where your ancestor worked. Local newspapers, if you want to look for an auto worker in the local newspapers, you might be looking for keywords like auto worker or labor or UAW. Local, historical societies. Any town that had an automotive plant often maintained records or oral recordings of workers. Obituaries may mention the employer or the plant. And lastly, family stories or home sources. Go with stories that have been passed down to your family, or documents like union cards or employee badges or news clippings about your ancestor. This is a very brief history of auto workers, but you sort of need to know what was happening throughout the period. By 1913, there were three main auto manufacturers: Ford, GM, and Chrysler. By 1913, Ford had created the mass production assembly line. But by the 1930s, GM led the industry, followed by Chrysler. Now, Ford paid high wages at that time, $5 a day, to attract quality workers and to reduce the turnover. By getting $5 a day, workers can make a good living for their family without much education. This was a way to enter the middle class. Now, the auto plants attracted a large, diverse group of workers. You had African Americans, Italians, East Europeans, German, and Irish immigrants going to work in the automobile plants. And unionization in the 1930s and 40s is going to lead to improved working conditions, guaranteed pensions, and health benefits for workers. So where do we go and how do we find employee records? As far as company archives go, Ford is the best for genealogy research. You email their archives at ford.com. GM and Chrysler archives are not as good as Ford because they focus on the car, not necessarily workers. Now, several museums hold employee records. They're too numerous to put on a slide, so I do have them in your handout. All libraries, or not libraries, all automotive plants had in-house publications. And you should check local libraries and historical societies for these in-house publications. The Ford publications are at the Benson Ford Research Center in Dearborn. The UAW records are found at the Walter P. Reuther Library at Wayne State in Detroit. And historical societies, both state and local societies, can be a valuable resource. In fact, the smaller historical societies may actually hold records that are unique to that town or that area, and they're not going to be in the larger repositories. Now, I said the Chrysler Archives didn't really have very much information about the workers, but the Chrysler newsletters highlighted employee milestones. So that might give you an insight into their lives and also individual people. So your ancestor, if he worked for Chrysler, might be listed. The Detroit Public Library has an extensive automobile collection, and that holds some employee records. The Ford Historical Archive at the Benson Ford Research Center in Dearborn also has early employee records. These are records from 1903 to 1933. Now, if you're thinking of contacting the Ford Human Resources Department, forget it, because the personnel files are not publicly accessible. The Sloan Museum of Discovery in Flint has exhibits on workers and information on the 1936 Flint sit-down strike. And the best one is the University of Michigan, because it has a database of Ford employees from 1918 to 1947. But what if your ancestor didn't work an auto assembly line? Well, you can also find information and occupations on them by looking at the census, because the census records from 1900 to 1950 list not only the occupations, but the industry and employers. Keywords are factory worker or assembly line worker, or the specific industry. Now, the World War I and World War II draft cards listed employers, and World War II era records might mention wartime production roles. City directories are going to list the plant where your ancestor worked, and obituaries often mention what plant the deceased worked for. So finding assembly line records. Well, you're going to first check your local library or historical society for closed plant records, because many companies donated their archives to the local library or historical society after the plant closed. Local or regional museums or archives near the plant are another place to look. Since plants were so vital to the community's economy, the local archives might have records about the manufacturing history of the area, and these records might not be found anywhere else. If the workers were unionized, check union records like the AFL-CIO or the United Steelworkers or International Brotherhood of Electrical Workers. Look into the Walter P. Reuther Library at Wayne State, the Kiel Center for Library Management Documentation, that's at Cornell, and the Southern Labor Archives at Georgia State. They also hold labor records. But we're also going to check some government records. Social Security may confirm the employment history after 1936. OSHA and the Department of Labor have records of inspections and strikes and plant incidents, which may name workers. The National Archives has records mentioning labor disputes, war production records, and factory inspection records. Your local societies or museums are going to detail the manufacturing history of an area. Newspaper articles might mention strikes, factory events, or even noticeable people. Check university archives, especially Cornell, Wayne State, and Georgia State, because they seem to have the lion's share of labor records. You're also going to check company archives. Now, there are some museums and archives for specialized industries that you might be interested in. The American Textile History Museum in Lowell, Massachusetts, covers the textile industry. It does have personnel files and employee pay records for that area. The Archives of Industrial Society, which is at the University of Pittsburgh, this is going to hold records of many regional companies, some national union companies, and they have a collection on African Americans in the steel industry. Corporate Archives Index. Now, this is an index to help you find business archives. So you might want to Google that and check that out, and that will point you to where a particular company's indexes or archives are. And I do have some other suggestions that are included in your handout. Before the popularity of cars and trucks, horse-drawn wagons were the primary means of transporting goods. The wagons were simple. They were mainly made of wood with steel-reinforced wheels, and they're pulled by horses and mules. And the speed of these wagons is determined by how fast the animals can go. My great-grandfather used to deliver ice and coal to the residents of Bloomington, Illinois, in a horse-drawn wagon. But by the time the 1920s came about, trucks had become such a commonplace sight on roads, they eventually replaced the horse-drawn wagons. So now we're going to find records about truckers. Truckers, many times in censuses, are listed as chauffeurs. You wouldn't think so, because you think a chauffeur is a private driver, but it has been listed as chauffeurs. I've seen them myself. Sometimes they're called haulers, carriers, or just plain truck drivers. You're going to find truckers in city directories. In the regular section, their name and occupation and employer are going to be given. And if you owned a trucking company, or if you're just, you own a truck, that's going to be listed in the business section of the city directory. Newspapers are often going to have articles about businesses, obituaries, giving a profession, or advertisements for business. If the employer is known, check the company archives for employee information. Now, owners of trucking companies or a guy with a truck need a permit or a business license to operate. Check city archives for licenses or permits. Now, some historic license information has been found in some genealogy databases. I remember reading and seeing an old-fashioned license years and years and years ago. But nowadays, you're not going to find information about someone's driving record or their file because the DMV is not going to release any information. The National Archives has a microfilm publication. It's called M2068. And they took a 1935 census about business. And this particular census gives information about the type of trucking companies and their finances in all the states. So check the National Archives. Union Archives should be checked for records, membership rolls. The International Brotherhood of Teamsters represents truck drivers. Where do you find sources? Well, you're going to start again at the company archive. And then if that doesn't work, we go to the state archives. Local and state historical societies will have information about local businesses. Union archives. Check local chapters for archival information on the people that joined from that area. And as I mentioned before, the National Archives has this publication about business and the schedules of motor trucking for hire. Now, in January of 2004, the National Genealogical Society magazine published an article in which the author explains how to use this census and what information can be obtained. So if you can get a hold of the NGS News magazine for January 2004, then I think you will find a fascinating article and a really hopeful article on how to find your ancestors in that particular publication. We're going to now transition to garment workers. The garment industry was historically located in the Tenderloin district, which is centered on the Lower East Side of New York City. Traditionally, women would sew pieces by hand from home. Later, they moved out from the home to work in loft factories. Census records, especially from 1900 to 1940, could list your ancestor as a garment worker or a seamstress. Now, that does not mean that a woman that sewed was a garment worker. My grandmother sewed all of my mother's clothes in the 20s and 30s, but she wasn't a garment worker. So if you see the term seamstress, just know that that meant it was a garment worker. City directories are going to give the name and address of the employer. Newspapers are going to list individuals that were associated with strike and also the women's suffragette movement. A lot of garment workers supported the suffragette movement. Now, historically, the garment industry attracted a lot of Jewish workers. Now, they are Asian and Latino. Check the company archives for records of your ancestor, if they still exist. And I think we know that if the company doesn't exist, then you check the local historical society and library to see if they've been donated. Union archives, like the International Ladies Garment Worker Union, are at the Kiel Center for Labor Management Document and Archives, or at Cornell University. Some historical societies have company employment logs. Check the local historical society. And also check industrial and labor history museums. The newspapers may mention your ancestor in a strike or a labor movement. And historical museums, like the Tenement Museum, are going to give you more of an idea of the general conditions the garment workers lived under and worked under. And in addition to the garment workers, other factory workers during that time. So where are we going to find sources for our ancestors' records? Well, obviously, as I said before, the company archives, if they have them. Unions. The ILGW union is at the Cornell University Center. This has personnel files. You also could check the Amalgamated Clothing and Textile Workers Union archives. University archives. Now, beyond the three that keep on being mentioned, New York University also has a labor archives called the Tamiment Library and Robert F. Wagner Labor Archives. Check that out. Harvard also has in their Schlesinger Library a collection of labor records. The National Archives has records from the Textile Workers Union. Sometimes museums will have records or displays about fashion and how it's evolved and what was involved in making the articles. You have the museum at the Fashion Institute of Technology in New York, and you've got the Textile Museum in Washington, D.C. Levi Strauss and Company's archives hold records of their personnel. You're also going to find articles in the ProQuest historical newspapers about the garment industry, and also strikes and individuals. Now, I know there's Chronicling America and other newspaper sources, but ProQuest is just specifically for historical newspapers. That leads us into unions. Many unions have their own archives. So Google AFL-CIO archives, and that will give you information on how to get to the archive. National Archives, NARA, has records from the Labor Relations Board. State archives will have records of local union chapters. University collections that are very strong in labor and management are Cornell, Wayne State, and UC Berkeley. Local historical societies and museums are also places where you can find information about a company and its workers. And then there's digital collections like Hathi Trust, the Digital Public Library of America. Their URLs are listed in your handout. And freedom of information requests are needed to file a request with government agencies like the National Labor Relations Boards or the Department of Labor for information. However, you have to be very specific about who and what you are looking for. You can't just say, give me my great-grandfather's employment history. His name was blah, 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 blah. You have to be very specific about what you're asking for. Now we're going to find photographers. You can start by asking family members the name of the studio your ancestor worked for, or they may have their own business. Now, if you don't know the studio that they worked for, but you know your ancestor took a professional portrait of your great aunt, and you knew this particular picture was taken by him, examine the front and the back of photos, because all studios would have their name and at least the city where they're located in, either printed or stamped on the front or the back of the photo. Censuses from 1850 onward are going to list occupations and employers. City directories will list an employer and occupation, but also check the business section, because the business section of the city directory is where you're going to find information about the studio. Trade directories for photographers are going to be a lot more specific than city directories. And we had already earlier on listed places where you can find trade journals, industry, newspapers, and publications. City and county histories are going to tell if your ancestor was an early settler in an area, but they're also going to list prominent people and their occupation. So where are we going to check for these records? Well, first of all, check libraries that have archives of local businesses. Local historical societies might have records of a closed studio. Photographer associations may have a list of people that are involved with them. Associations like the Photographers Association of America. You can search trade publications like Photographers Monthly. And as we said earlier, these are found in libraries and archives, state libraries and archives, most likely. Check the county or the city clerk's office for business licenses and permits, because they needed to have a license in order to run their business. Look for patents or copyright records on photographs. Maybe your ancestor was a photographer and he copyrighted a specific photograph, or maybe he developed an attachment for a camera to make it run faster. Or he could have asked for a patent for a new processing way for developing film. So look at the Patent Office or the U.S. Copyright and Trademark Office to see if there are any records of your ancestor. And then photography museums might have displays or knowledge about a specific photographer or studio. If you're going to see if your ancestor was in a certain area or had a funeral home in that area, check death certificates at local courthouses to see what funeral home or what mortician handled the deceased. And the same thing goes for cemetery records. A lot of times obituaries mention the name of the mortician or the funeral home. Check professional associations and license boards for state licenses all morticians, funeral directors, have to be licensed. The census records from 1850 onward will tell you if your ancestor is a mortician. Or in the 1800s, they were called undertakers. City directories are going to mention them by name, business, and address. And local historical societies could have records of closed funeral homes. A funeral home may be sold or be merged with another one, or they could just go out of business. And so the societies would have those records. So where do we find mortician records? Well, you start with the local funeral homes. Then you check funeral home associations to see if your ancestor was a member. The National Funeral Directors Association has been around since the 1800s. But the National Funeral Directors and Morticians Association has been around since 1924. And they also have state versions of that association. Check-in county and state archives. Also, local historical societies, state licensing boards are going to have records, and museum collections. Now, this sort of surprised me when I was putting this talk together because I don't normally think of museums dedicated to death and dying. But there's a National Museum of Funeral History in Houston and a Museum of Death in Los Angeles and New Orleans. So make sure you don't overlook those. Now, what happens if your ancestor works for the government? Well, agencies like the Post Office, the Department of Agriculture, or the Bureau of Indian Affairs, they keep their own records of civilian employees. NASA has the personnel records of civilian government employees. So you start with the did I say NASA? I apologize. It's NARA. Anyway, you start with the NARA catalog to look for specific agencies or record types. NARA has regional offices which are going to hold personnel records for employees working at the local or the state level. The Office of Personnel Management, OPM, has detailed employment histories, job titles, and positions of people, and that's part of the National Archives. The Federal Personnel Records Center, the FPRC, has records of employees, including files of those who worked in non-military government positions. So if you want information from either the OPM or the FPRC, you need to send a Freedom of Information request to the different agencies or go on their website. You're going to find civilian worker records in federal censuses after 1850. You find them being listed as a postmaster or a customs official. So you're going to find them in censuses. Now, if your ancestor worked for the government during wartime, the records could be in the War Production Board, and they may be listed if your ancestor was involved with manufacturing war-related goods during World War II. Or they might be in the War Manpower Commission, which is the agency overseeing labor during World War II. And they have records of workers in wartime industries. Defense contracts are at NARA. They're are records about contractors and their employees, which are found in certain specific archives that were vital to the war effort. Those are going to be found at NARA. State and local governments keep records of their employees. So if your ancestor was a cop in the 1890s in New York City, you're going to find his records at these city archives, but you can find other records for other local governments at the state archives, the city or county clerks or archives. Federal professional associations like the American Federation of Government Employees are going to have records. And then Social Security also has records which you can look at, or you can look at getting them, I should say. They're not on the website at all. I want to very quickly just touch upon the WPA and the CCC. These were programs created by the federal government during the Great Depression to help people find work. The WPA was the Works Progress Administration, and the CCC was the Civilian Conservation Corps. These included maintaining and building bridges, schools, public buildings, and it gave a lot of jobs to Americans that had all kinds of occupations, going from construction workers to artists. Now, many times you're going to find these records in regional NARA archives. And states also are going to have records related to projects that were done in their buildings. State archives will have WPA projects. State libraries in states with significant WPA and CCC works include New York, California, Texas, the Midwestern states. All of these states will have records of workers and projects in their state. The Library of Congress has historical information related to the WPA. Online databases like Ancestry, Full3, Family Search, and the National Archives Catalog will have information. Newspapers will also tell of projects that were being done in that town or region. And you can find oral histories of people that worked in the CCC and the WPA at the American Folklife Center, at the Library of Congress, and also universities. A lot of the universities will have oral history collections, including interviews. And finally, we come to the last segment, farmers. Now, in this segment, we're going to talk about the American farmer. Speakers have given whole presentations on the subject, including myself. But here are the highlights. You're going to find out whether a person was a farmer or not by checking the census records. Land records, including homestead records, will be found in county offices, the National Archives, the BLM's General Land Office records, and sometimes on Full3. Tax records can reveal whether someone is a farmer. Probate records, both the wills and the estate inventories. County histories, if someone was an early settler, they were a farmer, they'll be listed. If they were a very prosperous farmer, they're also going to be listed. And newspapers, both local and farm newspapers. will have information about farmers and individual farmers. Oops. Now, where do we go to find farm records? Well, the census, the population census, of course, but we have a couple of other censuses we can check. The agricultural schedules of 1850 to 1880. They're going to show how successful a farm is, what was grown, how much land was farmed. The census industry or manufacturer schedules of 1850 to 1880 are going to show farmers that had side businesses. Farm directories, like a city directory, farm directories can be found at Ancestry and Family Search, and also a lot of local libraries and historical societies. Agricultural newspapers can be found in the Library of Congress. Many farmers belong to organizations like the National Grange. Now, that was formerly called the Grangers, but they may have membership roles. So check the state archives for local chapter. Local historical societies are going to have information. University agricultural schools. When a university was first set up in a state, the agricultural school was set up right with it. And there are agricultural schools that are as old as the university itself. And they're going to have libraries devoted to farming and rural life. Agricultural museums like the National Agricultural Center and Hall of Fame is going to have information, and state museums are also going to have information about farms. So you have a lot of different places you can start to check. And agricultural unions like the UFW, United Farm Workers, may have information. Now, the UFW is a modern union. It was founded in 1966. So it won't have your ancestors in the membership roll, but it might have your relatives. And with that, I would just like to conclude by giving you some thoughts I have on the subject. Researching the occupations of our ancestors isn't just about finding facts. It's about gaining perspective. Each occupation tells a story of resilience, skill, and dedication. By researching our ancestors' stories, we honor their contributions and we get a better understanding of our own roots. By exploring the records, we recognize that our ancestors' struggles and achievements paved the way for where we are now. Every occupation, no matter how humble, has a value, and every story is worth uncovering. If you have any questions about today's presentation, or if you find a link that's broken, I would appreciate hearing from you. Just drop me a line at myana4@gmail.com. And I have to actually apologize to my audience. This was the first time I've given this talk. And so you are my guinea pigs. And so I apologize if you weren't treated to as good a delivery as I usually have. I was very nervous about this particular talk. So with that, I'll be very happy to take any questions.
Well, thank you, Madeline. That was a very, very meaty presentation with a lot of very dense, and you did have some good questions along the way. Let's see. Let's start with Ann Burrows said, my grandmother worked as a domestic and lived at the Y in Minneapolis. Any records for domestic workers?
Oh my goodness. I did some research on that. It wasn't included in today's talk, but generally you're not going to find. Oh, wait a minute. Before I go on, what time period are we talking about?
Anne, what time period? Oh, I'm going to let me change things so that everyone can unmute themselves. Okay. Okay, you can unmute yourself now, Anne, if you want to respond directly.
And what time period are we talking about?
Oh, there I go. I'm sorry. I tried several times to unmute myself. Um, it's US and it's probably I would say 1870s maybe.
Ah, okay. Um, anyway, I did do some research on that because I was thinking about including it, but I decided not to. You're not going to find a lot of records about domestics because if they happen to be lucky enough to be at the place that they would work at, at the home that they would work at when the census enumerator came, they might be listed on the census records. It sounds like she would be listed on the Y records for the time, but at that time, there were no unions for domestic workers. There weren't very many organizations they could apply to. Unless she belonged to a union or an organization, you're not really going to find any records. And that's a sad thing because my grandmother's older sister worked as a domestic down in Nashville. And we barely can find anything that's about her. Because if she lived with the family, she would be included in records about the family, like city directories and so on. But if she lived elsewhere, you're not really going to find any records except for, let's say, a census that was taken while she was living at the Y.
Yeah,
So
that's that's actually where I found her.
Yeah.
I just got a wild hair one day and thought, well, what if I search for my grandmother by herself, not necessarily with her family? And boy, there she popped up, and I was really good. I mean, it was a good surprise.
Well, that's really good. And a lot of domestics, um, especially a lot of Irish domestics, would go to a place and they would work there and they would be there before the family would come. So they'd send the older daughter, to work someplace and then the family would come later. So a lot of times they were not living in the same household as their parents and siblings.
Thank you.
Okay, Susie Wickman has a question. Does an ancestor have to work at a railroad until retirement for there to be employment records?
I wouldn't think so.
Yes and no. My grandfather worked for the railroad. I had a grandmother that worked for the railroad, but she was on a different side of the family. But my grandfather worked for the railroad and he was an electrician. And he left the railroad before 1936. We have very few records of employment from him other than just like a pay card, um, a, a notice, a written notice that so-and-so was docked for. You're not really going to find a lot of them. Now, after 1936, you're going to, I would say, look for the railroad archives, find the railroad that they worked for, like I did, and see if they're listed in the archives. But the Railroad Retirement Board is really gonna it's like Social Security. I mean, it's really gonna have the kind of records you'd have at Social Security. So if they worked for the railroad before 1936, you might have a chance contacting the archives of the place they worked for, and maybe there might be state archives that might also have records. So you're going to have to do a little bit of digging for that, but I hope that answers your question.
Okay, we have another kind of an observation from Betsy Wright. She says, I have a great uncle that was killed in a railroad yard accident in the early 1900s in Winona, Minnesota. Newspaper articles said his wife, who was pregnant with her 6th child, would be fine because of the great railroad pension. I found in the next census she was taking in wash to support her family.
No, remember before 1936, most railroad pensions were private pensions, and that was tied to whether or not the business did well or not. So if the railroad made a lot of money, the benefits were going to be good. But if the railroad started losing money, that started affecting pensions and benefits. And so they started losing. In fact, there were some people that were, I read an article about these people that were very afraid that if the railroad lost any more money, I guess that particular railroad was going through a hard time. If they lost any more money, then these people would lose their pension entirely. So that was really one of the reasons that the Railroad Retirement Board was created.
Hey, Marcia Kestner offers this bit of information. Ford also has a genealogy society within their organization. One of their past presidents spoke to the El Dorado Hills Genealogical Society during COVID.
Wonderful. May I include that in my next talk? I did not know that. I had not come across that, but that is fantastic. Ford, for some reason, really goes out of its way to make its records available to the public, whereas the others, not only do they not have as many records, but they chose not to focus on those records. So they have a genealogy department. Well, thank you for that information.
I think Ford was pretty progressive in a lot of different ways.
Oh,
You know,
yes.
Not only the assembly line, but a lot of other types of things that you might not think a company would do.
Mm-hmm.
Here's another question from Susie Wickman. Does the Archives of Industrial Society at the University of Pittsburgh include steel mill employment?
Oh, they might. If I remember right, they had a lot of industries records and also a lot of union records too. So I would contact them to find out, but it seems to make a lot of sense that that would be where they would have those records if they had them. So yeah, I would think that they would.
Let's see, Karen Ellingson offers compliments on the amazing presentation and a wonderful handout.
Thank you, Karen. I was very nervous, more so than other talks, because this was a very jam-packed talk. So I
Yeah.
appreciate your comments. I was very nervous.
And Ann Burrows adds a suggestion for the farmers section, add the Farm Bureau.
You are right. That is in my talk about farmers, but I was trying to make this a little bit shorter. Thank
You
you.
covered a lot of
I will
ground.
add that, because the Farm Bureau was very critical. I don't know why I didn't think of it before. Thank you, Anne.
We need to have you back to give that talk.
Actually, I think I did that a couple years ago. It might be
Oh,
on
did
the
you?
YouTube.
I think you did. I think you
Yeah.
did do a farmer presentation.
I also remember that day I wasn't feeling well. I was sick that day. So the presentation may not be great, but the information's wonderful.
That one probably is in our
That's
in
an
our
old
YouTube
one.
channel. It's an old one,
Yeah.
but I think it might still be there.
Oh, good.
Yeah.
I'll look. Thank you.
Let's see. Katie Baker asks, can you go over any hints about occupations in the early California aerospace industry beginning in 1930?
Oh, wow. I'll be honest. I have no knowledge of the aerospace industry. I can just go on with what was presented today and also last month when we talked about larger companies. Are you looking for employee records? Are you looking for union records attached to that? What kind of records are you looking for?
I think Katie Baker may have signed off.
I didn't.
Oh.
I'm here.
Oh, there we go.
I just was
Excellent.
having trouble finding the go to button. Not just any specific, but during the war time effort,
Uh-huh.
the manufacture of aircraft, and then as it grew, going into to later in the 40s and into the 50s.
Well, I would first start with the archives of the company. And also, because these were wartime records, the OPM has records of employees and companies that made essential things for the war effort. The War Production Board and the War Manpower Commission. Now, this is going to be at the National Archives. So look in those two collections.
Okay.
Especially,
oh, sorry.
oh, I was going to say, especially the War Production Board.
Thanks. That's great ideas.
You're welcome.
Don Hayden offers some compliments. Thank you for such a fabulously exhaustive coverage. So many of my family's occupations were in these categories. Looking forward to leveraging many of these leads. Rich and enjoyable
Thank you.
presentation.
Thank you.
Judith has a question, Judith Scale. My husband's great-grandfather worked as a consulate in a Central American country? Where can I get more info?
Well, that's not part of our talk, but I can tell you that the consulates are under the Department of State. So you might want to contact the Department of State and then find out from them what kind of information. Now, I don't know if anyone would have records of what went on in the consulate. I would think that the National Archives would, because again, these have to go back to the Department of State. But I would try with that department. And if you have to do a Freedom of Information Act, then, so be it. But other records would be in the National Archives. You might want to use the National Archives catalog to just see what type of records there are for each agency or department.
Thank you.
And Claire Waite and Lori offer their compliments for the thorough and excellent presentation. And that brings us to the end of our current list. Does anyone else have any more questions?
I can speak to a little bit about New England. Lowell, Massachusetts has really done considerable about saving their information on the mills that were in Lowell. And also Manchester, New Hampshire is doing a lovely job with their old mill yards, reusing the buildings. And with I'm sure they've got records somewhere. I can't tell you where, but Manchester,
Oh, they do.
New Hampshire.
Yeah.
And it has a lovely airport, which is easier than Boston. Not that far away.
Actually, there's a museum.
Yes.
There.
Yes.
And from what I was able to find is that they have records and connections that you'd be able to find information about the textile industry.
Yes.
Any more questions? Well, I'm going to get my my shameless plug in here for next month's presentation. Next month, we are having Ephemera, Scraps of Your Ancestor's Life with Gina Philibert Ortega. Paper items that were not meant for long-term archiving. Ephemera can hold great genealogical value. So that should be pretty interesting. For next month, that is going to be February 22nd. And if anyone needs a copy of our current schedule of upcoming genealogy presentations, I can post that to the chat as well. Any more questions while I do that? Okay, I'm going to post it.
Thank you, Madeline. That was a great talk.
Oh,
I'm
thank
sorry
you.
we're nervous. I don't think you ever have to be nervous because you're such a good presenter and you're so thorough and your handouts are so detailed. I really appreciate that a lot.
Well, thank you, Anne. That means a lot. I think the reason I was nervous was that there is a lot of occupations in this talk, more so than there would be topics in other talks. And so that's why I was not sure about that, but I appreciate the fact that you enjoyed it. And I hope that all of you are going to be able to find a little bit of information with the things that I've given today about your ancestors. If nothing else, it's sort of a cool thing to get, a copy of a pay record. They made so much money as such and such a day. It's going to help you give an idea of who they were and what they were about. And that's going to end up affecting your ideas about yourself and your roots.
Well done as usual, Madeline.
Yeah. Well, thank you too, Dave.
You're welcome. It's always a pleasure doing these presentations.
And Dave, I have heard Gina's talk on ephemera, and it is absolutely delightful.
Oh, wonderful.
Yeah,
Yeah,
very interesting how she found some of her stuff.
yeah, I'm looking forward to it. Oh, new message here. What is it? Oh, more thanks for Madeline from John Coulter.
Oh, thank you.
Okay. Oh, okay, there we go. Oh, shoot. Okay, I posted my upcoming presentations in the wrong chat thread. I posted it directly to Don Hayden, and we want it to go to everyone. Let's get that done. And then if we can have any final question and then wrap things up. Let's see that. Okay. Okay, there's our schedule for our upcoming presentations through July. So I've added one more. Some of you may not have July there. That's the new July presentation is Finding Your Railroad Ties by Cindy Brennan. A new speaker we haven't had before.
She's very good.
Oh, good to hear. I've heard other recommendations for it too.
Yeah.
Okay, any final question? All right. Thank you, Don. Okay. Again, thank you, Madeline, for the very great presentation, and thank you all for attending and for sticking around for all of this very meaty presentation. All right, here we go. Goodbye, all.
Bye.
Goodbye.